All right, so get this. We're diving into a United Nations peace proposal today.
Really?
Yeah, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this.
Okay.
We're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Interesting.
And this document is making some seriously bold claims.
What kind of claims?
Well, for starters,
Oh, okay.
it's proposing some pretty radical solutions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it we're looking at exactly?
Well, this proposal was written by a guy named Mark Gaffney.
Gaffney, okay.
But get this, he had some help from an AI.
Oh, wow, an AI.
ChatGPT 4.0 to be exact.
So we're talking about a human and AI collaboration on a peace proposal for one of the world's longest-running conflicts.
Exactly. That's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, totally.
But this is real, and the ideas in here are wild.
Okay, you've got me hooked. I need to hear more.
Well, Gaffney doesn't hold back on the drama.
What do you mean?
He opens by saying, human civilization is at a pivotal moment. Live or die.
Wow, talk about setting the stakes high.
I know, right? But he's not exaggerating the significance of this conflict either.
Of course not. This is a conflict that's been going on for generations.
Exactly, and both Palestinians and Israelis feel this incredibly deep connection to the land.
Right. They both see it as their rightful homeland, their holy land.
And that's where Gaffney does something I really didn't expect.
Okay, what's that?
He brings in Descartes, the philosopher. You know, I think, therefore I am.
Descartes, that's an interesting connection. What does that have to do with a peace proposal?
It's a brilliant move, actually.
Okay, how so?
Gaffney uses Descartes' ideas about questioning everything to challenge the certainty that people have in their religious beliefs.
Oh, I see. He's saying that unwavering certainty can be a major driver of conflict.
Right, especially when we're talking about land that's considered sacred by multiple religions.
So a little doubt might actually be a good thing in this situation.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but I can see how clinging to rigid beliefs could make compromise almost impossible.
Absolutely. And it gets even more interesting.
How so?
Gaffney tackles the whole concept of the promised land.
Okay, the promised land, that's a core belief for millions of people.
Exactly. And instead of seeing it as belonging to one group, he reinterprets it as a test of faith for all three Abrahamic religions.
Wait, hold on. How do you reframe something as fundamental as the promised land?
Well, he suggests that this land isn't about ownership.
Oh.
It's about how each side lives up to the ideals of their faith. It's about proving your worthiness through compassion and coexistence, not conquest.
That is a radical departure from traditional interpretation.
Yeah, it definitely turns conventional thinking on its head.
It does. But I'm curious where ChatGPT fits into all of this.
Yeah, it feels like we've jumped from philosophy to theology without even mentioning the AI.
Exactly.
Well, ChatGPT's fingerprints are all over this proposal, even though it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where Gaffney's ideas end and where the AI's begin.
That makes sense.
There are sections, though, where ChatGPT's voice seems to really come through.
Like where?
Well, there's this fascinating analysis of the Promised Land as a test of divine mercy, almost like a challenge to prove our capacity for compassion.
That does sound like an AI perspective.
It does, doesn't it? It's this fascinating blend of deep philosophical and theological thinking.
Right, and then you have ChatGPT seemingly adding this layer of almost mathematical pragmatism on top of it.
Exactly, and that's just the beginning.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Gaffney goes on to suggest that history itself is like a coding problem.
A coding problem.
Yeah, that religious texts and traditions have become fragmented and coded with divisions over time.
So instead of getting stuck in those old codes, we need to rewrite the program, so to speak.
That's one way to put it.
And find a new way to interpret those texts that promotes understanding and unity.
Right, and this idea is closely connected to his view on the nature of God.
Go on.
He introduces this concept of a living God, one that isn't static or confined to ancient interpretations.
So instead of an Old Testament guide, as he puts it, we need to embrace a more dynamic understanding of faith. I have to admit, this is making me rethink some of my own assumptions about religion and conflict.
That's what's so compelling about this proposal. It challenges us to think differently about everything.
All right, so we've got this foundation of philosophy and theology and even computer science. Where does Gaffney go from there? What's his actual solution?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. He proposes a one-state federalized system.
A one-state solution.
Yeah, similar to the United States, but with equal rights and shared governance for both Palestinians and Israelis.
Wow, that's completely different from the two-state model that's been discussed for decades.
It is a complete reimagining of the political landscape.
I have to admit, I'm skeptical, but also incredibly curious to see how he justifies this.
Well, that's what we'll be digging into next. We'll explore the potential benefits and the enormous challenges of such a radical proposal, and we'll try to untangle the role that ChatGPT played in shaping it. So stick with us because this deep dive is just getting started.
Okay, I'm ready. So we've laid out Gaffney's vision.
It's pretty ambitious.
But let's be real, is this even remotely feasible? I mean, a one-state solution with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. A region that's been marked by conflict for what seems like forever.
Exactly. Countless attempts at interfaith dialogue have been made in this region, and they haven't exactly led to lasting peace. So what makes Gaffney's approach different?
Well, he's not just promoting dialogue.
Gotcha.
He's calling for a fundamental shift in how we view the entire conflict itself.
So how does he do that?
Remember how he reframed the Promised Land as a test of faith?
Yeah.
A challenge to rise above our differences?
It changes the whole game.
Exactly.
But I keep coming back to the suffering and the historical grievances of both sides.
Yeah.
How do you address the pain and trauma that have been inflicted on both Palestinians and Israelis? Can a philosophical approach truly heal those wounds?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
Critics might argue that Gaffney's proposal is too abstract, too detached from the lived realities of the conflict.
I can see that. It's one thing to talk about unity and shared governance, but how do you build trust when there's so much history of violence and betrayal?
That's a good question.
And how do you even begin to implement such a radical solution?
It's a huge challenge.
Both sides have entrenched political systems with very different ideologies.
Yeah.
I mean, is a federalized one-state solution even remotely feasible given the current political climate?
This is where Gaffney's proposal faces its biggest hurdle.
Yeah.
He doesn't really delve into the practicalities.
What do you mean?
Like, how would you structure a government that represents such diverse populations? How do you ensure equal rights and security for everyone?
It's hard to imagine what that would even look like.
Yeah.
And what about Jerusalem?
Right.
That's a holy city for 3 major religions.
Yeah.
How do you share something that's so deeply sacred to multiple groups?
It seems almost impossible.
It does.
Gaffney's proposal doesn't offer a lot of concrete answers.
Okay, so maybe we need to step back for a second and consider the role of ChatGPT in all of this.
Okay.
Could it be that the AI is filling in those practical gaps?
It's possible. There are passages where ChatGPT's voice seems particularly strong.
Like where?
Like when it emphasizes democracy as a tool for interfaith governance.
Okay.
That feels very much like an AI perspective, a focus on systems and structures.
Right, rather than philosophical ideals.
Exactly.
It's almost like ChatGPT is providing the blueprints while Gaffney lays the foundation.
It's an interesting way to think about it.
But could this collaboration actually lead to a workable solution?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
This proposal really pushes us to consider AI's role in diplomacy.
You think AI could help us find solutions that humans have overlooked?
It's possible.
Could it bridge the gap between those lofty ideals and practical realities?
We just don't know yet. It's definitely a question worth exploring.
It is. But before we go any further down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I think it's important to address one of the more controversial elements of Gaffney's proposal, his concept of a living God.
Okay.
This idea seems pretty radical,
It definitely challenges traditional views on faith.
even dangerous to some.
Right.
So how does Gaffney define a living God?
Well, he contrasts it with what he calls an Old Testament God, a static and unchanging deity.
He's suggesting that our understanding of God and even faith itself needs to evolve,
Right.
adapt to the changing world around us.
Yeah.
But doesn't that open the door to moral relativism?
It's a valid concern.
I mean, if faith is constantly evolving, where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
What happens to our core values and principles?
Gaffney acknowledges that challenge.
Okay.
He argues that faith shouldn't be a rigid set of rules,
Okay.
but rather a living, breathing thing that engages with the complexities of the modern world.
So a more nuanced understanding of God's will.
Right, one that embraces change and seeks common ground.
It's definitely a provocative idea.
It is.
And he seems to be suggesting that this dynamic approach to faith is essential for achieving peace in such a deeply divided region.
Exactly. By clinging to those rigid interpretations of religious texts and historical narratives, we perpetuate the cycle of conflict. To find peace, We need to be open to new interpretations, new ways of understanding our relationship to God, to each other, and to this land.
Okay, I see. So this idea of a living God isn't just a theological concept. It's the foundation for his entire peace proposal.
Right. It's about creating a more flexible and adaptable framework
For understanding the concept.
Exactly. He's not just advocating for a change in borders or political systems.
Okay.
He's calling for a fundamental shift in consciousness, a new way of thinking about ourselves and our place in the world.
It's incredibly ambitious.
It is.
But I'm still not convinced it's realistic.
I understand.
We're talking about deeply ingrained beliefs, centuries of history, and a whole lot of mistrust. How do you bridge that gap?
That's the challenge, isn't it? To bridge the gap between those lofty ideals and the messy realities on the ground.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
We've spent this deep dive unpacking some really complex ideas. But this wouldn't be a true deep dive if we didn't also explore the potential pitfalls of Gaffney's vision.
Yeah, absolutely. As fascinating as this proposal is, we need to play devil's advocate here.
Exactly. Like, how do you actually create a federal system that's fair and equitable for two groups that have been in conflict for so long?
It's not easy.
It's easy to say one state, but the details are incredibly complicated.
He talks about a one-state solution modeled after the United States.
Right.
But even the U.S. has a long and complicated history with federalism and equality.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect system by any means,
And replicating it in a place like Israel and Palestine would be incredibly challenging.
to say the least.
It feels like you'd need a massive cultural shift for this to even be remotely possible.
Definitely.
We're talking about generations of ingrained mistrust and animosity.
Right.
How do you overcome that?
That's the key question. Even if you could somehow create a fair and equitable system on paper, would people actually buy into it?
Would they be willing to let go of old grudges and embrace a shared future?
It's hard to say.
And even if you could address those cultural and political challenges, what about security?
Yeah, security is a huge concern.
Both Israelis and Palestinians have experienced violence and terrorism.
Right.
How do you create a system where everyone feels safe and protected?
It would require a level of trust and cooperation that simply doesn't exist right now.
And we can't forget about the economic disparities.
Right.
There's a significant wealth gap between Israelis and Palestinians. How do you address those imbalances in a way that's fair and sustainable?
You're hitting on all the major points. These economic disparities are deeply rooted in the history of the conflict, and simply creating a single state wouldn't magically erase them.
So what would?
You'd need a comprehensive plan for economic development and resource sharing.
Okay.
And that would require a huge amount of political will and international support.
It feels like there are so many potential pitfalls, so many ways this could go wrong.
Yeah,
Is Gaffney just being hopelessly idealistic?
maybe.
Is it even worth considering such a radical proposal when the obstacles seem so insurmountable?
That's the debate, isn't it? Is he a visionary or a dreamer?
Right.
But even if his specific proposal isn't feasible, maybe it can serve as a catalyst for a new kind of conversation.
You mean a conversation that moves beyond the limitations of current thinking?
Exactly. One that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths and imagine possibilities we hadn't considered before.
So even if we never see a one-state solution in our lifetime, maybe this is a step towards breaking down those mental barriers that prevent us from imagining a different future.
Perhaps. And it's worth noting that ChatGPT seems to be pushing for a more pragmatic approach.
Right.
Focusing on things like democracy and shared governance.
It's as if the AI is trying to ground Gaffney's idealistic vision in something more concrete and achievable.
Exactly.
It does make you wonder, could AI help us bridge the gap between idealistic visions and practical solutions?
That's a great question.
Could it help us navigate these complexities in a way that humans haven't been able to?
AI has the potential to analyze vast amounts of data, identify patterns, and even predict outcomes.
So could it help us identify potential solutions that have been overlooked?
It's possible.
Could it help us anticipate and mitigate the risks of such a radical proposal?
It's certainly possible.
But we also have to be cautious about placing too much faith in technology.
Absolutely.
AI is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Right.
We need to be thoughtful about how we integrate AI into these sensitive processes.
I agree.
And we have to remember that it's ultimately humans who make the decisions.
You're right. We can't outsource our responsibility to machines.
But perhaps AI can help us see the problem more clearly, identify new possibilities, and make more informed decisions.
Yeah, maybe.
It's definitely a conversation worth having.
Yeah.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some challenging ideas, and wrestled with some pretty big questions.
We've examined the philosophical underpinnings of Gaffney's proposal.
Right.
We've analyzed its potential benefits and drawbacks.
And we've even touched upon the role of AI in shaping the future of diplomacy.
But now it's your turn, listener. What do you think?
Does this proposal, as radical as it is, offer a genuine path to peace? Or is it simply a utopian fantasy?
Could AI play a constructive role in resolving these complex human conflicts?
We've thrown a lot of information your way, and now it's your turn to grapple with these questions.
What stood out to you most in this deep dive? What new insights did you gain?
What are you still wondering about?
What new avenues of inquiry has this proposal sparked for you?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. The search for peace is an ongoing journey, and your voice is an important part of that journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.